The sun filtered through the large bay windows of the Grantwood estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, casting golden streaks over the marble floor. It was a Monday like every other, and the morning routine in the mansion was already in motion. The staff moved like clockwork, silent, swift, invisible. Among them was Rosa Bennett, the maid who had worked in this grand home for nearly 11 years. Her hands were rough from scrubbing tiles and folding linens, but her eyes still carried the quiet strength of a woman who had seen too much and spoken too little. She moved gracefully, dusting the antique frames in the hallway that led to the study. The house, though beautiful, was always cold, not just in temperature but in spirit. The man who owned it, Jonathan Blake, was a millionaire real estate tycoon known for his stoicism, unmatched discipline, and a face that hadn't cracked a genuine smile in over a decade. Jonathan Blake was a creature of habit. He rose at 6, jogged around the estate grounds, and had his coffee precisely at 7:10. No sugar, no cream. Everything in his life was scheduled, precise, sterile. People in the town admired his success but pitted his loneliness. His wife, Amanda, had died 12 years ago in a car crash that remained etched in the headlines for weeks. Since then, Jonathan had built an empire, row upon row of luxury buildings in New York City, Miami, even Chicago. But his mansion, despite all its opulence, felt more like a museum of memories than a home. Rosa had seen the worst of life. She had moved to the United States from Honduras as a teenager, fleeing violence, chasing safety. She worked as a waitress, then a janitor, and eventually got hired as a housemaid by the Blake family shortly after Amanda's death. Rosa rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her daughter, Sophie, had grown up in the shadows of this mansion, always told to stay out of sight, not because Jonathan had forbidden it, but because Rosa knew the unspoken rules of the rich. Servants serve, nothing more. That morning, however, something shifted. Sophie had come to see her mother briefly before heading to school. She was 15 now, tall for her age, with long chestnut hair and hazel eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unasked questions. She was polite, always well-mannered, and had never caused any disturbance. Rosa had asked her to wait by the back kitchen entrance, but as fate would have it, Sophie wandered a little further into the main hall, curious about the grandeur that surrounded her but never welcomed her. Jonathan was coming down the staircase, tightening his watch strap, when he saw her. He paused. Sophie turned around as she heard the footsteps and froze. Their eyes locked. His expression changed almost instantly, from curious to confused, then to something darker. For a second, it was as though he had seen a ghost. Sophie mumbled a soft "sorry," and backed away, disappearing down the hallway as Rosa appeared from the other side, panicked. "Mr. Blake, I'm so sorry." "She shouldn't have, she was just leaving," Rosa said, breathless. Jonathan didn't say anything immediately. He stared at Rosa, then down the hallway where the girl had vanished. His hands curled into fists by his sides. "I want her gone," he said coldly. "You too. Today." Rosa's heart dropped. "Please? Mr. Blake, I've worked here for years." She was just. "I said today," he repeated, already walking away, his voice ice cold. Rosa stood frozen in the corridor. The house that had given her stability, the job that had allowed her to raise her daughter with dignity, it was all taken from her in a moment. She couldn't understand what had just happened. What did he see in Sophie's face that made him so furious? She packed their things quickly, barely speaking to Sophie. The girl sensed something was terribly wrong but didn't ask. Rosa didn't have the words. She left her key on the kitchen counter and walked out of the mansion that had been both her prison and her protection for more than a decade. The gates closed behind her, not with a bang, but with a silence that echoed louder than any noise. Inside, Jonathan sat in his study, staring at a framed photograph of Amanda. His late wife had been the love of his life, warm, funny, kind. The moment he saw Sophie's face, it was like seeing Amanda again, not just in a vague resemblance, but in such a striking way that it unsettled every part of him. The tilt of her smile, the shape of her nose, even the dimple on her left cheek, it was all Amanda. But that was impossible. Amanda had never known Rosa. Had she? Jonathan picked up his phone but hesitated. The image of the girl haunted him. Something didn't make sense, and he hated things that didn't make sense. He prided himself on logic, order, and clarity. But this was chaos. He didn't know what it was yet, but deep inside, a voice whispered something he wasn't ready to hear. What if that girl is your daughter? Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. The face of the girl kept appearing in his mind, no matter how many times he tried to brush it off. Every time he closed his eyes, there it was again. The same hazel eyes, the same gentle smile, the same expression Amanda used to have when she was quietly amused. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, the silk sheets offering no comfort. The mansion that usually felt like a fortress now seemed to echo with doubts. His thoughts ran wild. Could it really be possible? Could Rosa have been hiding something from him all these years? He tried to reason with himself. Amanda had died over a decade ago. Sophie looked about 15. The timeline was tight but not impossible. The thought hit him hard and fast. What if Amanda had lied? Or worse, what if Rosa had? By the time the sun rose over Greenwich, Jonathan had made up his mind. He couldn't let it go. He had to find out the truth no matter what it cost. He canceled his meetings for the day and pulled out an old journal Amanda used to keep. It had been years since he opened it. Her handwriting filled the pages with details of charity events, recipes, quotes from books she liked. He flipped through the pages hoping to find some hidden hint, something that connected Amanda to Rosa. But nothing stood out, until he reached a page dated July 2008, a few months before Amanda's death. It read, "Started working with the new gardener and the housemaid. Rosa is kind. Speaks very little English but seems honest. Something about her makes me feel calm." Jonathan froze. So they had met. He had forgotten Rosa had joined them just around that time. His chest tightened. He went to the drawer where Rosa's old employment files were kept. In her hiring documents there was a photo, much younger with shorter hair but unmistakably Rosa. He stared at it. Could she have possibly had a relationship with someone else in the house? Could Amanda have known about it? Or, God forbid, was there something between him and Rosa that he had erased from memory? He remembered those months as a blur. Amanda was busy with events and he had been working late, constantly stressed. He recalled drinking more than usual back then, especially after some heated arguments. But no, that couldn't be. He would remember something that serious. Wouldn't he? He decided to call someone who might know. Laura, Amanda's best friend. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the funeral, but she answered on the second ring. "John?" she said, confused. "Is everything okay?" "I need to ask you something odd," he said, pacing across the living room. Laura listened carefully as he explained what had happened the day before, about firing Rosa, about seeing the girl, about the strange resemblance. She was quiet for a while before speaking. "Amanda never said anything directly," she said carefully, "but there was one time, she mentioned feeling like someone close to her was keeping a secret. She was worried but she wouldn't tell me who or what. Just said, some things are better left unknown. That was the last I heard of it." Jonathan hung up and sat down, overwhelmed. He stared out the window at the manicured lawn and the empty driveway. A 15-year-old girl had turned his entire world upside down with just one look. He realized he needed answers, real ones. He needed to find Rosa. But he had fired her without warning. She could be anywhere by now. He called his assistant Heather, and told her to quietly find any information she could about Rosa's current address. Heather was discreet, efficient, and didn't ask questions. Within 2 hours, Jonathan had the address, a modest apartment complex in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Not far, but a world away from the luxury of Greenwich. He debated going in person or calling. In the end, he decided to drive. Some things couldn't be done over the phone. As he pulled into the apartment lot later that afternoon, he felt strangely nervous. The building was old but clean. He climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor and knocked on apartment 3B. After a long pause, the door opened slowly. Rosa stood there, her face pale, eyes wide with surprise and a touch of fear. "Mr. Blake?" she said, barely above a whisper. "I need to talk," he said. "Please." She stepped aside silently, and he entered the tiny living room. There were books piled on a wobbly table, an old couch, and framed school pictures of Sophie on the wall. He stared at one of them. The resemblance was even stronger in the photo. He turned to Rosa. "Who is her father?" he asked bluntly. Rosa looked down, gripping the hem of her shirt. "Why does it matter now?" "Because I need to know," he said, voice cracking. "She looks exactly like Amanda." Tears welled up in Rosa's eyes. "I never wanted to cause problems. I never asked for anything. You're not answering my question." Rosa looked up slowly, pain written all over her face. "I don't know exactly," she said. "It was one night. You had come home late. Amanda had gone to her sister's. You were drunk and hurting. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have left that night." The room fell silent. Jonathan sat down, numb. His mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. He had no memory of that night, but her words rang with the kind of sorrow that couldn't be faked. It was possible. More than possible. Sophie might be his daughter. "I need to know for sure," he said. Would you allow a DNA test? Rosa nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. Only if it's kept private. For her sake. Jonathan agreed. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. He had built skyscrapers across the country, crushed million-dollar deals in minutes, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Jonathan sat quietly in his study, the DNA test kit lying unopened on the polished mahogany desk before him. The fire crackled in the corner of the room, but its warmth couldn't reach the cold weight that pressed on his chest. He had spent the entire day trying to concentrate on work, reviewing proposals, answering emails, attending a board call, but his mind kept drifting back to that tiny apartment in Bridgeport and the girl with hazel eyes. He hadn't spoken to anyone about it since his visit to Rosa, not even Heather. The idea that he might have a daughter, a child he had never known, was unraveling everything he thought he knew about his past. He picked up the test kit and stared at the label. All he needed was a cheek swab from Sophie, and the lab would do the rest. It seemed so simple. But emotionally it was anything but. 2 days later he drove back to Rosa's apartment. It was a gray afternoon, the clouds hanging low over the streets. Sophie answered the door this time. She looked at him with a calm expression, curious more than anything else. "Are you here to talk to Mom?" she asked. Her voice was polite but firm, like someone older than her years. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Yes, but I'd like to talk to you too, if that's all right." Sophie nodded and stepped aside. Rosa stood in the kitchen, watching them silently, her hands trembling slightly as she dried a glass with a towel. Jonathan explained everything, how he had seen her, how he had noticed the resemblance, and how he needed to be certain. He didn't mention the night Rosa had spoken of, not in front of Sophie. He just said he needed clarity for everyone's sake. To his surprise, Sophie agreed without hesitation. "If it helps you understand, I'm okay with it," she said, her eyes steady. "I've always had questions too." Rosa looked like she wanted to stop her but didn't. There was a kind of dignity in her silence that Jonathan respected. They completed the test at a private clinic in Stamford the following morning. It was quiet and discreet, no flashing cameras, no drawn-out process. Just a simple swab, carefully sealed and sent to a lab in Boston. The results would take about a week, but Jonathan felt like every hour was stretching into a year. In the days that followed, his behavior changed. Heather noticed he was quieter, more thoughtful. He asked for fewer meetings, took long walks around the estate, and spent more time in Amanda's old garden, now somewhat overgrown but still blooming in places. One afternoon he found himself staring at a rose bush Amanda had planted. He hadn't touched it in years, but now he knelt down and began pruning the dead stems carefully, one by one. As he worked, memories came flooding back. Amanda laughing in the kitchen, her arms around his neck, the way she used to hum while setting the table. The pain of losing her felt fresh again, but this time it was mixed with something new, guilt. He realized that he had lived the past 15 years on autopilot. He had buried himself in work, cut himself off emotionally, and never questioned what might have been left behind. If Sophie was truly his daughter, what would that mean for the life he'd missed with her? Could he even begin to make it right? He thought of her face, so much like Amanda's, and the way she had looked at him with quiet understanding. She didn't know him, yet she hadn't turned him away. The call came 6 days later. The lab technician confirmed that the results were in and available to view online. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He opened the file with shaking hands, reading every line twice to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The conclusion was clear and direct. 99.99% probability of paternity. Sophie was his biological daughter. The paper trembled in his hands. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Then everything went silent. No thoughts, no doubts, just the stunning weight of truth. He drove straight to Bridgeport again, not bothering to call ahead. When Rosa opened the door, he simply showed her the file. Her face paled as she scanned the page, then she nodded slowly. "I knew," she whispered. "I just didn't know what to do with it." Jonathan sat down, emotions rushing through him like a flood. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, voice hoarse. Rosa looked away, her eyes shining. "Because I thought it would ruin your life. You had just lost Amanda. I couldn't be the reason you suffered more. And then years passed and Sophie was growing and she was happy. I didn't want to take anything from her. Or from you." He stared at her, stunned by the quiet strength she carried. "You should have told me," he said. "I lost 15 years. Rosa nodded. "I know. I'm sorry." Then from the hallway Sophie stepped out. She had heard everything. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just walked over and sat beside Jonathan. "So it's true," she said softly. You're my father. Jonathan turned to her slowly. Yes, I am. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then finally Sophie smiled. Well, that's weird, she said, half laughing. But also kind of cool. Jonathan laughed too, the tension breaking just slightly. He looked at her and saw not just Amanda's features, but something entirely her own, sharp, resilient, bright. I want to be a part of your life, he said. If you'll let me. Sophie nodded, her smile lingering. Let's just start with coffee, she said. We'll figure the rest out. As they sat there, sipping the tea Rosa brought over, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. A new beginning. An unexpected chapter. One that he never saw coming, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed to feel alive again. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Jonathan never imagined he'd be sitting in a modest cafe in downtown Bridgeport on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, sipping lukewarm coffee across from a teenager who looked so much like Amanda it twisted his heart. Sophie stirred her hot chocolate slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flickered with something between curiosity and cautious hope. The soft hum of conversation and clinking cups filled the background, yet all Jonathan could hear was the echo of years lost, moments he had never lived, birthdays he hadn't attended, scraped knees he hadn't kissed, and bedtime stories he had never told. He wanted to ask her everything, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. So he started small, asking about school, her favorite subjects, the books she read. She answered calmly, occasionally smiling, her words thoughtful, not rushed. He learned she loved science, especially astronomy, and spent her evenings reading about galaxies and stars. She had dreams of working for NASA someday, and Jonathan found himself picturing her in a lab coat, surrounded by data screens, chasing the stars. As they talked, he noticed how mature she was for her age. It wasn't just the way she spoke, it was the quiet strength in her posture, the way she held eye contact, the way she didn't hesitate to challenge his opinions, but never with disrespect. He realized Rosa had raised her to be confident, not submissive, and he admired that deeply. Still, guilt chewed at his insides. He kept wondering how different things might have been if he'd known, if Amanda had lived, if Rosa had told him earlier. But regrets, he knew, were useless now. All he could do was move forward, one conversation at a time. Later that evening, after walking Sophie home under the drizzle of light rain, he stayed for dinner. Rosa had cooked a simple meal, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and a lemon tart that reminded him painfully of Amanda's baking. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and the conversation floated between casual chatter and awkward silences. But somehow it wasn't uncomfortable. It was raw, unfamiliar, but strangely warm. After dinner, as Rosa cleaned the dishes, Jonathan stood by the window, watching Sophie in the next room as she scrolled through something on her phone. She's remarkable, he said quietly. Rosa smiled faintly, not looking at him. She's her mother's daughter. Jonathan swallowed hard. He could hear the unspoken words in that simple sentence. As he drove back to his estate in Greenwich, the road slick and glistening under the headlights, his mind swirled with a dozen emotions. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Integrating into Sophie's life would require more than a few conversations and apologies. She had lived her whole life without a father. Now here he was, expecting to fill that role. It would take time, patience, understanding. But he was willing. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with business deals or property investments. It was personal, raw, and real. The following weekend, he invited Sophie and Rosa to visit his home. Rosa hesitated at first, but Sophie was curious. I want to see where you live, she said frankly. It's only fair. You've seen where I live. Rosa eventually agreed, and on Sunday morning Jonathan picked them up in a modest sedan, not his usual luxury SUV. He didn't want to create distance with wealth. When they arrived, Sophie's eyes widened as they pulled into the long, winding driveway. The estate wasn't gaudy, but it was clearly grand. Tall oak trees lining the drive, gardens blooming even in early spring, and the large, ivy-covered house standing like a quiet sentinel at the end. This is different, Sophie murmured, stepping out of the car. Jonathan led them through the house, pointing out old photos on the walls, Amanda's piano that no one had touched in years, and the library that still held her books. You can take any of these, he told Sophie, watching her fingers trace the spines of novels and memoirs. She picked one, a book on the Hubble Space Telescope, and smiled. She read this. Jonathan nodded. Twice. They walked through the garden next, and Sophie paused by the rose bush Amanda had planted. Did you prune this recently? She asked. Yeah, Jonathan said, a little surprised. How could you tell? Sophie shrugged. I garden sometimes. Mom and I have a few pots on the balcony. Tomatoes and herbs mostly. Jonathan smiled, the image of them together planting seeds on that tiny balcony etching itself into his mind. Later, as they sat on the porch sipping lemonade, Sophie looked at him and asked, "What now?" It was a simple question, but it carried 1,000 meanings. He took a breath. "Now we just spend time. Share things. You set the pace. I'm not here to force anything. I just want to be part of your life if that's okay." Sophie nodded slowly. "Okay. I think I'd like that." Rosa, sitting nearby, gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes but was sincere nonetheless. She still held her reservations and Jonathan couldn't blame her. But there was no hostility, just cautious hope. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting golden light over the lawn, Jonathan realized something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not the shallow kind that came with financial success or social status. This was deeper, tied to connection, belonging, and rediscovery. He wasn't trying to replace anything that had been lost. He was trying to build something new, something honest. The following weeks unfolded like pages of a delicate diary, each day marking a slow but steady shift in Jonathan's life. He had begun adjusting his daily schedule, not for a business merger or a board meeting, but to make time for Sophie. It was unfamiliar territory, waking up early to drive to Bridgeport just to have breakfast with a teenager he was still learning to understand, or waiting outside her school to surprise her with a cup of her favorite chai latte. For a man whose calendar used to be booked months in advance, these spontaneous, ordinary moments felt oddly fulfilling. Sophie had warmed up to him quicker than Rosa had expected. They shared text messages, inside jokes, and even started a little tradition of movie nights every Friday. Jonathan would bring takeout, Sophie's choice, and they'd sit on Rosa's worn couch, watching everything from old sci-fi classics to modern dramas. He listened as Sophie explained star constellations and black hole theories, her eyes lighting up with passion, and he found himself engrossed, not in the films but in her excitement. Rosa, however, still carried a visible distance, always lingering on the edges of the room when Jonathan visited. She was polite, even kind, but rarely softened. Her boundaries were clear, her tone composed. It wasn't anger that held her back, it was years of quiet struggle, and the instinct to protect her daughter from anything that could bring disappointment. Jonathan respected that. He never pushed. He would often glance at her when Sophie wasn't looking, catching the way her jaw tensed when he mentioned Amanda or when Sophie hugged him too long. He understood what it meant. Rosa had done everything alone, and now he was here, sharing what he hadn't earned. That sort of grace takes time to accept. One afternoon, Sophie asked Jonathan to attend a science fair at her school. She had built a model of the solar system using recycled materials and wanted him to see it. Jonathan, who hadn't stepped inside a public high school since his own teenage years in Albany, felt an unexpected nervousness walking through the bustling halls of Harding High School. Kids brushed past him with backpacks slung low, the walls plastered with posters and announcements. But the moment he saw Sophie standing proudly next to her project, her hair pulled into a high ponytail, cheeks flushed with excitement, his nerves disappeared. She beamed when she saw him. "You came." He smiled genuinely. "Wouldn't miss it for the universe." She rolled her eyes at the pun, but her grin said it all. He listened as she explained her model to the judges, watched her interact with her classmates, and felt a strange pride swell in his chest. It was an unfamiliar sensation, almost paternal, and it hit him harder than he expected. After the fair, they stopped by a small diner for burgers and shakes. Sophie talked about her plans, how she wanted to apply to Caltech or maybe MIT, and Jonathan promised to help however he could. "Even if it's just proofreading essays," she joked. "Especially if it's that," he replied. But not every moment was easy. One evening, while Jonathan waited for Sophie outside her apartment building, he overheard Rosa speaking to someone on the phone through the open kitchen window. Her voice, though low, carried an unmistakable edge. "He's trying, I can see that. But I still don't trust it. One DNA test and a few fancy dinners don't erase 16 years. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but he couldn't unhear it either. Those words stung not because they were unfair but because they were true. He had missed too much: prom night dresses, scraped elbows, failed tests, and first heartbreaks. He couldn't go back, only forward. And forward meant earning Rosa's trust, not expecting it. The next weekend something shifted. Sophie invited Jonathan to a father-daughter bowling night organized by a local community center. "I know it's cheesy," she said, "but they give out trophies. I want one." Jonathan hesitated for a second. The idea of being surrounded by real fathers and their daughters, knowing he hadn't earned that role yet, made him feel like an imposter. But Sophie looked at him with that stubborn sparkle in her eye, and he found himself nodding. "Let's win you that trophy." They bowled like amateurs, laughed through gutter balls, and cheered every strike. By the end of the night, they hadn't won first place, but Sophie was awarded Most Spirited Team, and she clutched that small plastic trophy like it was gold. On the ride home, she said quietly, "Thanks for being there. It means a lot." Jonathan glanced at her and said, "I should have always been." Later that night, Rosa opened the door for them and noticed the trophy. "Did you win?" she asked. "Kind of," Sophie smiled. "It's a participation trophy," Jonathan admitted. Rosa's lips twitched into something resembling amusement. "Well, that's a start." For the first time, she didn't seem guarded. Maybe it was the sight of Sophie's happiness or the effort Jonathan had shown without needing applause. Maybe it was just time working its slow, patient magic. Whatever it was, something had softened just a little. And as Jonathan drove back through the quiet streets of Bridgeport under a sky full of stars, he couldn't help but wonder how different his life would have been if Amanda had lived. But he didn't stay in that thought long. Because what mattered now wasn't the past he couldn't change, it was the future he had a chance to build. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Jonathan had never been a man of rituals, but over the past month, stopping by Rosa's small apartment in Bridgeport after work had quietly become a part of his routine. Not because he had to, but because it now felt like the only part of his day that made sense. At Fairfield's sprawling corporate campus, he still wore the expensive suits, still chaired meetings and signed off on major investments. But no spreadsheet or stock graph gave him the same jolt of anticipation as walking up those worn steps and hearing Sophie's voice before he even knocked. That day, Sophie had texted him a few hours earlier, "Big surprise. Be ready." He wasn't sure if it was good or bad, but she added a winking emoji, which he took as a good sign. When he stepped inside, the apartment smelled like fresh-baked cookies. Rosa was in the kitchen wearing an apron that said, "Too hot to handle," in faded letters. For a second, Jonathan thought she might actually be smiling, and it nearly disarmed him. "She made them," Rosa said, nodding toward the table. "By herself." Sophie peeked out from her bedroom, holding a large manila envelope in her hand. "Not the cookies. This is the surprise." She handed him the envelope and watched his face closely as he pulled out the contents. Inside was a short essay typed in double-spaced with the heading, "My Hero." It was a school assignment. He began reading quietly, and the words pulled the air from his lungs. She had written about him. About how meeting her biological father had changed the way she saw herself. About how a stranger who had made a terrible mistake was trying day by day to fix it. About how he listened, really listened, and how that made her feel seen for the first time. Jonathan's throat tightened. He looked up, blinking fast. "You wrote this?" he asked. Sophie shrugged. "You inspired it." Rosa from the kitchen said softly, "She got an A." Jonathan had been given awards and plaques and glowing magazine profiles, but none of them had touched him like this one-page essay. He wanted to say something profound, but all he managed was, "This means the world to me." Later, as they sat around the small dining table eating cookies, he noticed Rosa watching him in a way she hadn't before. Less cautious. Maybe even curious. After Sophie went to bed, Jonathan lingered by the door. "That essay," he said. "It's everything." Rosa nodded. "She means every word of it. But you should know, she's hopeful. That kind of hope, it's fragile." "I know," he replied. "I won't let her down." The next day, Jonathan made a decision he hadn't expected. He called his attorney in Stamford and began the legal process to formally include Sophie in his will. Not just a token trust fund, but something substantial. Something that said, without any public announcement or headline, that he recognized her as his daughter, fully and permanently. He didn't tell Rosa yet. Not because he was hiding it, but because he wanted to do it right. Earn it, not announce it. He also began calling in favors, college counselors, grant officers, scholarship board members, asking subtle questions about what kind of support a promising girl from Bridgeport with high SATs might need. It was a line he never thought he'd cross, mixing personal life with influence, but this felt different. This was fatherhood, not business. One rainy Friday evening, Jonathan invited both Rosa and Sophie to dinner at a quiet little restaurant in New Haven he used to visit back when Amanda was alive. It wasn't fancy, but the food was warm and the lighting soft. Sophie wore a navy blue dress that Rosa said she'd worn for her 8th grade graduation. Jonathan brought her a small bouquet of daisies. "I Googled your favorite flower," he confessed. She grinned. Rosa sat across from him, guarded at first, but by dessert they were sharing stories about their childhoods. He learned that Rosa used to draw portraits as a teen, and that she once dreamed of becoming an art teacher before life got in the way. He asked her what stopped her. Money, she replied. Timing. Baby. The usual reasons. He said nothing, just listened. And for the first time she didn't flinch under his gaze. As the evening wound down, Sophie excused herself to the restroom, leaving the two adults alone. You've changed, Rosa said, not accusingly but with a hint of wonder. Jonathan took a sip of his wine. I didn't know what I was missing. And now I do. People say that kind of thing, she replied. They usually don't mean it. I mean it, he said quietly. I want to help her. Not just with college or money. I want to be there for the things you've been there for. The little things. The big things. All of it. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. If you hurt her, I'll never forgive you. He nodded. That's fair. When they got back to the apartment, Sophie hugged him longer than usual. Best night ever, she whispered. Jonathan drove home with the radio off, the sound of the rain like a soft drumbeat on the windshield. He felt something unfamiliar, a quiet sense of peace. The journey wasn't over and there would be missteps ahead. But for the first time he wasn't just trying to fix a mistake. He was building something new. Something real. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The following Monday morning, Jonathan sat at the long mahogany table in his office at the investment firm in Stamford, trying to focus on a board meeting, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sophie and Rosa. He barely heard the financial analyst's quarterly report or the update on the firm's new partnership in Seattle. He kept thinking about Sophie's essay, her laughter over dinner, and Rosa's eyes softening ever so slightly as they sat across from each other. A few months ago he wouldn't have imagined himself in this position. Emotionally entangled, personally invested, genuinely happy in ways no net worth ever brought him. The meeting ended and he didn't linger. Instead he drove straight to Bridgeport, something he never would have considered during the workweek before. He picked up 2 coffees and a small bag of chocolate croissants from a bakery Rosa once said she liked, and when he knocked on the door of the modest apartment she answered in a sweatshirt and sweatpants, completely caught off guard. Is everything okay? She asked. Everything's fine, he said, holding up the bag. I just figured I'd trade breakfast for conversation. She stepped aside wordlessly, and for the next hour, they sat at her tiny kitchen table, sipping coffee, talking about nothing and everything. That day marked a quiet shift in their relationship. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but it was something more than co-parenting. Rosa was cautious, but Jonathan could tell her guard was gradually dropping. She even laughed at one of his bad jokes, and when Sophie returned home from school and found him there, she didn't seem surprised. He's part of the furniture now, she joked, throwing her backpack on the couch. Over the next few weeks, their lives began weaving together in small but meaningful ways. Jonathan helped Sophie prepare for her science fair, driving her to a hardware store in downtown Bridgeport for materials and building the project with her in his garage in Westport. They stayed up late, covered in glue and wires, laughing more than working. Rosa joined them for dinner on weekends, and sometimes they'd all go for long walks along the beach in Seaside Park, bundled up against the brisk Connecticut spring wind. These were ordinary moments, but to Jonathan, they felt like fragments of a life he didn't realize he'd always wanted. One Sunday afternoon, while Sophie was out with a friend, Rosa and Jonathan sat in his living room, sipping tea. A lull in the conversation opened a door he'd been standing in front of for weeks. I've been thinking, he began carefully, about how to make things easier for you and Sophie. Rosa gave him a sideways glance. We're okay. You've already done more than enough. I want to do more, he said, voice steady. I want to help pay for college, and I've already started paperwork to set up a trust for her. Not just for college, long-term security. Rosa went quiet. You don't owe us anything, Jonathan. I know. This isn't about debt. It's about doing what's right for my daughter. She flinched slightly at the word my but didn't correct him. He continued, I also want to help you. I remember you saying you wanted to be an art teacher. If you ever wanted to go back to school, take a class, anything, I'd support that too. She looked down into her cup, her fingers tightening around it. You think just because you're rich you can fix everything? No, he said gently. But I can try to make some things better. Her silence stretched between them until she finally whispered, let me think about it. That night, Jonathan lay awake in his bed, wondering if he'd pushed too far. But the next afternoon Rosa texted him. Do you know anyone at Norwalk Community College? Asking for a friend. He smiled for a long time before replying. He did know someone, and by the end of the week, Rosa had an appointment with an admissions counselor. Sophie, unaware of the discussions happening around her, was flourishing. Her teachers called home more often now, but with praise. She'd been selected as a finalist for a statewide essay competition, and one of the judges, a professor at Yale, had written her a personal note commending her perspective and maturity. Jonathan framed it for her and hung it beside the family photos that were slowly beginning to populate the apartment walls. One evening she curled up next to him on the couch and said, "You know, I used to tell people my dad was dead. It was easier." He swallowed hard but didn't interrupt. "Now," she continued, "I tell them he's a genius who invests in the stock market and buys croissants for breakfast." He laughed, but the emotion in his chest made it hard to breathe. The next weekend, Jonathan invited both Rosa and Sophie to a fundraiser gala in Hartford for a charity he supported that helped underprivileged kids get into college. He thought it would be meaningful for Sophie to see how philanthropy worked up close, and Rosa agreed. They dressed up, Sophie in a lavender dress and Rosa in an elegant black gown Jonathan had arranged for a stylist to bring over. When they walked into the ballroom, heads turned. Not because of who Jonathan was, but because of how the three of them looked together, comfortable, connected, almost like a real family. Throughout the evening, donors and old acquaintances approached, asking about the beautiful young lady beside him. Jonathan introduced Sophie with pride, calling her "my daughter" each time, and no one questioned it. At one point, Rosa stood near the bar, watching them with a soft, unreadable expression. When he finally joined her, she simply said, "You're good at this." "What, pretending?" he teased. She shook her head. "No. Being a dad." Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. A few days after the gala in Hartford, something shifted. Not in any obvious way, there were no arguments, no cold shoulders, but Jonathan began sensing a distance creeping in between him and Rosa. She still replied to his texts, still joined him and Sophie for Sunday dinners, but there was a hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. One evening as they sat on the back porch of his Westport home, the sun melting into the Long Island Sound, Rosa finally gave it words. "I've been thinking about moving," she said quietly, looking out over the water. Jonathan turned toward her, startled. "Moving where?" She didn't meet his eyes. "North Haven. Closer to the college. I've been offered a spot in a weekend program and it just makes sense. The commute is killing me." He was quiet for a long time. "Are you doing this to get away from me?" Rosa sighed. "No, Jonathan. I'm doing this for myself. For Sophie. For the future. We can't live in this in-between space forever." Her words stayed with him all night. He knew she was right. Their lives had become a series of interwoven moments, but none of it had been defined. There was no label for what they were. He wanted to believe they were becoming a family, slowly, naturally, but maybe Rosa needed more than that. Or maybe she was afraid. He didn't blame her. She had been alone for so long, forced to depend on herself, protect herself. Trust didn't come easy when life had handed you disappointment after disappointment. And yet, the idea of Sophie living farther away, not just a short drive from him, unsettled him deeply. The next morning he made a decision. He took the day off from work and drove to Rosa's apartment. She was surprised to see him again so soon. "You forgot something?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I forgot to ask you something important." He took a breath. "Don't move. Or if you do, let it be to a place we choose together. I'm not asking for everything at once. I just don't want this to end before it really begins." Rosa stood still, unreadable. "You think we can just step into this like it's a storybook? Like it's simple?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "I think it'll be hard. Messy even. But I'm willing to try. I want to try, with both of you." She looked at him for a long time, eyes flickering with emotion. "I need time, Jonathan. This isn't a decision I can make in a day." He nodded. "Take all the time you need. But don't think for a second that I'm going anywhere." Sophie in the meantime was thriving. Her science fair project had not only won first place locally, but had also been selected for a state-level showcase in New Haven. She was ecstatic and Rosa and Jonathan both cleared their schedules to be there. On the day of the event, Sophie stood beside her project with pride, answering questions from judges, talking with other students, completely in her element. As they stood off to the side watching her, Jonathan reached out and gently took Rosa's hand. She didn't pull away. Instead she squeezed back. Later that night, as they all ate ice cream in a diner near Yale's campus, Sophie turned to them and said, "I like it when we're together like this. It feels right." Neither adult spoke immediately, but their eyes met across the table, and in that quiet exchange, a decision began forming in both their hearts. The next week, Rosa found a small rental house in West Haven, just 25 minutes from Westport and 15 from the college. It wasn't a huge move, but it was enough. Enough to show she wasn't running away. Jonathan helped with the deposit, but let her sign everything herself. It mattered to her being independent even when accepting help. Moving day was hectic and emotional. Sophie was thrilled about the new room, which had a window facing the backyard and space for all her books and posters. Rosa was quiet but seemed more at ease than Jonathan had seen her in weeks. That night, after the boxes were unpacked and pizza boxes emptied, he sat with Rosa in the living room. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "But I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be." Rosa looked at him, her eyes soft. "Let's take it one chapter at a time." Weeks turned into months and their new rhythm began to feel natural. Rosa started classes, Sophie joined a local writing club, and Jonathan found himself driving between Westport and West Haven more often than he expected, but with no complaints. He started leaving a toothbrush at Rosa's house, a jacket in her closet. Slowly, his presence became permanent in subtle ways. One evening, while helping Sophie with a school project, she turned to him and said, "Can I call you Dad?" The question knocked the air from his lungs. "If you want to," he said carefully. "Only if you really want to." She smiled shyly and whispered, "I do." That night he cried for the first time in years. But as everything seemed to finally be falling into place, a letter arrived that would threaten to upend it all. Rosa found it first, tucked among bills and coupons in the mail pile. It was from a law firm in Stamford. The return address alone made her uneasy. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling as she read. It was from Jonathan's ex-wife's attorneys. They were requesting DNA test results related to Sophie. The letter was brief, but the message clear. Someone was questioning Sophie's place in Jonathan's life. Someone who didn't want this newfound happiness to continue unchecked. Rosa stood frozen in the kitchen, the letter fluttering in her hand, the words burning into her chest. When Jonathan arrived later that evening, she didn't speak. She simply handed him the envelope. As he read it, his face darkened. "She knows," he muttered. "Beth knows about Sophie." Rosa's voice shook. "What does she want?" Jonathan looked up, eyes filled with fury and something else, fear. "She wants to ruin everything." Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The rain had started falling over the quiet suburbs of Newton, Massachusetts, as if the sky itself was releasing all the weight of tension that had built up over the last few weeks. Benjamin sat alone in his sunroom, the DNA report still lying open on the table beside him. His world, once sharply divided into neat categories, wealth, power, trust, had been irreversibly shaken. The truth that the little girl he had once thought was just his maid's daughter was, in fact, his own flesh and blood, had opened wounds in him that he hadn't even known existed. Memories of his reckless years in Los Angeles started to flash again in his mind, years full of parties, fleeting relationships, and thoughtless actions. He remembered her now, Sophie, quiet and kind, the girl who used to clean up the messes from his wild nights in that Beverly Hills condo. He had never imagined she would carry something so permanent from those days, his daughter. Meanwhile, Danielle sat in her small apartment in Somerville, watching her daughter Leah drawing with crayons on the floor. Sophie had told her everything. The job she took with Benjamin back then, the one mistake that changed her life, and the decision she made to never tell him. Danielle hadn't asked many questions. Sophie had been a good friend, and when she passed away last year, she had left Danielle with a promise to raise Leah as her own. It wasn't easy juggling part-time jobs and daycare, but Leah had brought more joy into her life than anything else ever could. And now that joy had turned into a storm of questions when Benjamin fired her after seeing Leah's face and suspecting something deeper. The DNA test had only confirmed what her heart had already whispered to her. The resemblance between Leah and Benjamin wasn't a coincidence. It was late evening when Benjamin drove through the narrow streets toward Danielle's building. He hadn't called, hadn't warned her, just followed the gut feeling that had kept him up for nights. He rang the bell and Danielle opened the door, her face tightening when she saw him. "We need to talk," he said, voice soft but firm. Danielle stepped aside, letting him in without a word. Leah looked up from the floor, her little eyes wide and curious. "Hi," Benjamin said, kneeling down, unsure how to speak to a child who was his own daughter. "Hi," Leah replied shyly, offering him a crayon. Danielle watched, unsure whether to cry or smile. Benjamin took a deep breath and sat across from Danielle at the kitchen table. "I read the results," he said. "She's mine." Danielle nodded. "I never meant to hide anything. Sophie wanted to tell you, but by the time she found out, she'd already left LA. She didn't want to complicate your life. She thought you wouldn't remember her. She was right, he admitted, the guilt weighing heavily on him. I was a selfish man. Still am maybe. But seeing Leah that day, I don't know, something inside me changed. I didn't fire you because I was angry at you. I fired you because I couldn't look at her and not see the truth staring back at me. Danielle looked at him, her expression softening. So what now? He looked at Leah, now humming a tune as she drew a purple sun. I want to be part of her life, he said. I'm not here to take her away. I'm not going to fight you or demand anything. But I want to support her. I want to help raise her. I want to know her. I want her to know me. Danielle remained quiet for a moment. She deserves to know where she comes from, she said. And if you really mean what you're saying, then you're welcome in her life. But don't hurt her, Benjamin. Don't make promises you can't keep. She's been through enough already. From that day on, Benjamin began visiting them every weekend. At first, Leah didn't fully understand who he was, but she enjoyed his company. He brought her storybooks and puzzles, and once he even brought a puppy. Danielle laughed and scolded him for spoiling her, but the smile on Leah's face was worth every lecture. Slowly they all settled into a new rhythm. Benjamin started a college fund for Leah and hired a private tutor to help with her speech delays. But more than money, he gave her time. He read to her every night on video calls when he traveled for business, and he attended her kindergarten recital in Quincy, sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes. Months passed and winter turned to spring. Benjamin invited Danielle and Leah to his home for dinner, this time as guests, not employees. The staff had changed the air warmer. Leah ran through the garden, laughing, while Benjamin and Danielle watched from the porch. You know, he said, sipping coffee, for the first time in my life I feel like I'm doing something right. Danielle smiled. You are. She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, he replied, eyes fixed on Leah. She saved me. And so, a story that began with suspicion and silence found its way to love and redemption. Benjamin, the millionaire who once saw people as employees and problems to solve, had found the one person who made him see life differently, a little girl with her mother's eyes and his smile. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still challenges, still wounds to heal, but there was hope. And sometimes that's all you need to begin again.